Jake Walker's boots crunched through the fresh snow as he made his way back to his small ranch on the outskirts of town. The night had come quickly, and the cold wind cut through his thick coat. It wasn't unusual for the winter nights to feel this bitter in the West, but tonight the chill seemed especially harsh. Jake was used to the solitude that came with living alone in the wide-open spaces. But tonight, even the silence seemed to weigh heavy on him. The only sounds were the crunch of his boots and the occasional howl of the wind. Jake wasn't a man who often sought the company of others. He preferred the quiet, the peace that came with working his land, tending to his animals, and keeping his own company. He had made his peace with loneliness, and life had never seemed to be anything more than that, a solitary existence. But as he walked up the familiar path toward his home, something caught his eye in the distance. He stopped for a moment, squinting against the blowing snow. He saw a figure moving slowly along the road ahead. At first, he thought it might be one of his neighbors. But as he got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a woman. Her steps were uneven, and she appeared to be struggling. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He recognized her immediately. Maya, the young woman who had recently arrived in town to marry Earl, his neighbor. He didn't know much about her, except that she had come from a faraway country, and Earl had been quick to introduce her as his new bride. Maya was a quiet, reserved woman, and she had never seemed to fit in with the gruff, stoic man Earl was. The few times Jake had seen her, she had seemed distant, almost lost. But there was nothing about her that made Jake think she would be out in the snow, alone, and struggling to stay on her feet. He broke into a run, his instincts kicking in. As he reached her, he saw that she was shivering uncontrollably, her face as pale as the snow around them. Her lips were a deep shade of blue, and her eyes, when they met his, were filled with confusion and fear. "Maya," Jake called out, his voice sharp with concern. "What are you doing out here? You're freezing." She didn't respond at first, swaying slightly as if she might collapse at any moment. Jake reached out and caught her in his arms before she could fall. Her body was cold, much colder than it should have been. He could feel the icy chill of her skin, and panic surged through him. "Come on," he muttered to himself. "Let's get you inside." He carefully lifted her into his arms and turned back toward his ranch, his mind racing. What was she doing out here alone? Where was Earl? He didn't like the thought of her being in such a dangerous situation, especially not in this brutal cold. By the time they reached his house, Maya was barely conscious, her body limp in his arms. Jake managed to get her inside and laid her down in front of the fireplace. He wasted no time building up the fire, feeling the heat slowly begin to fill the room. Maya's breathing was shallow, and her eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again. "Hang on, Maya. You're going to be all right," Jake said quietly, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. He worked quickly, removing her wet clothes and covering her with warm blankets. Her teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and he could see the faint blue tinge still lingering around her lips. He grabbed a pot of hot water and poured it into a small mug, adding a little honey to it, hoping it would help warm her from the inside. As Maya slowly began to come around, Jake noticed how delicate she looked, how frail. He had always thought of her as just another neighbor, someone who had come to the West in search of a better life. But now, seeing her like this, he realized how much she had been through. The woman who had barely spoken to him in the past few weeks now seemed like a completely different person, one who was vulnerable and in need of care. Jake had never been good with people, especially women, but something about Maya's situation tugged at his heart. She stirred again, her eyes opening to slits as she looked up at him. "Where am I?" she whispered hoarsely, her voice barely audible. "You're at my place," Jake replied gently. "You were freezing out there. I couldn't just leave you in that snow. You're safe now." She blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Earl? Where's Earl?" Jake hesitated. He didn't know how to explain it, or if he should even try. Earl had always seemed like a man who didn't care much about anyone, least of all, his wife. Jake had seen it in the way he treated her, with indifference, almost as if she were just another piece of property to him. But Maya's question was innocent, and he didn't want to make her feel worse. "He's not here," Jake said carefully. "You were out there alone, Maya. It's dangerous to be out in the snow like that." Her eyes closed again, and she seemed to drift off, but not before she mumbled, I was supposed to go to town, to get supplies. Earl needed them. I don't know how I got lost." Jake's heart tightened. It sounded like something was wrong, something that went deeper than just getting lost in the snow. He could sense it in her words, the faint hint of something she wasn't saying. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, or maybe it was the shock of being so close to freezing to death. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Maya wasn't telling him everything. With her resting by the fire, Jake tried to make sense of everything. He had heard bits and pieces of her story, the whispers of her background, of how she had come from a poor village far away, hoping for a new life with Earl. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly knew about her. She had been here only a few weeks, but in that time, it seemed as if she had already become a ghost, someone who didn't truly belong in her own life. Hours passed as Jake kept watch over her. The storm outside had not let up, and he knew it was too dangerous for her to leave anytime soon. He offered her some more warm tea. And this time, she drank it, without hesitation. The fire crackled, and Jake tried to keep his thoughts focused on helping her recover, but his mind kept returning to one question. Why had she been out there, alone, and lost? It wasn't just the cold that worried him, it was the idea that something was wrong with her marriage. Jake didn't want to get involved in something that wasn't his business. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Maya's situation than met the eye. He glanced over at her, now sleeping peacefully, her breath deep and steady. The tension in his chest began to ease. At least she was safe now. But Jake knew that the morning would bring more questions. And as much as he told himself to stay out of it, he couldn't ignore the strange pull he felt toward her, a feeling he had never expected to experience. As the night wore on, Jake settled into a chair near the fire, keeping watch. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for now, he was content to let Maya rest. Whatever her troubles were, whatever her past held, he was determined to help her get through the night. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find a way to help her beyond that. But that was a decision for tomorrow. For tonight, all that mattered was that she was safe and that he had done what he could. The morning light filtered through the small window in Jake's living room, casting a soft glow over the fire that was still crackling in the hearth. Maya had slept the night through, her breathing steady and calm. And for the first time since bringing her inside, Jake felt the tight knot in his chest loosen. The storm outside had not yet passed. But inside, it was warm and safe. Maya was no longer shivering, and the color had returned to her face. She was no longer the fragile woman he had found half frozen in the snow. Jake rose early, as he always did. He stoked the fire and prepared a pot of coffee. He glanced over at Maya, who was still asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility for her, as if the events of the previous night had tied their fates together in a way he couldn't explain. As the warmth of the fire spread through the room, Maya began to stir. She blinked awake, groggy at first. Before her eyes fully opened, she seemed confused for a moment, looking around the room as if she didn't quite understand where she was. When she saw Jake, her expression softened with recognition. "Good morning," Jake said quietly, offering her a warm smile as he set a mug of steaming tea on the small table beside her. "How are you feeling?" Maya sat up slowly, still wrapped in the blankets he had given her the night before. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, maybe an explanation, or perhaps an answer to the many questions she had. I'm all right. Much better, thank you," she said in a quiet voice, her accent soft but clear. Jake watched her for a moment, noticing how fragile she still seemed despite the color returning to her cheeks. "You had us all worried last night," he said, his tone a mix of concern and relief. "How did you end up out in that snowstorm?" Maya hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket as she looked away. The look in her eyes was distant, almost as if she were somewhere else, far from the warmth of the room. I don't know exactly. Earl sent me to town to get some supplies, but I must have taken the wrong path. I tried to find my way back, but the storm caught me. Everything was so blurry. I didn't know what to do." Jake nodded, understanding the confusion and fear that could easily come with being lost in such a harsh storm. But something in the way she spoke, her reluctance to tell the full story, made him wonder if there was more to the situation than just getting lost. "You shouldn't have been out there alone," Jake said firmly, though his voice remained gentle. "Especially in this weather. It's dangerous. And it looks like Earl didn't even notice you were gone until I found you." At the mention of her husband, Maya's face clouded with a flicker of emotion. It was a brief flash, but it was enough for Jake to catch. There was something wrong with the way she spoke about him. Something deeper than just a simple misunderstanding. Maya sighed, lowering her head, as though the weight of everything was too much for her. "Earl, he doesn't notice much." "Not really," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I first came here, I thought things would be different. I thought I'd be happy, maybe find a home, a place where I belonged. But it hasn't been like that. Not at all." Jake felt a pang of sympathy in his chest. He didn't know the full story of Maya's marriage, but from what he had seen of Earl, it didn't surprise him. Earl was the kind of man who kept to himself, never truly engaging with anyone, not even his own wife. He could see now that Maya had been struggling in silence, and perhaps that was why she had found herself out in the storm lost, both physically and emotionally. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Jake said, not wanting to push her too hard. "But just know that you're safe here. You don't have to go anywhere unless you're ready." Maya looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of judgment, but all she saw was kindness, a quiet understanding that seemed to ease the weight she had been carrying. She nodded slowly, grateful for his offer of peace, but still, she seemed conflicted, as if the decision she faced was more complicated than she could explain. "I don't know what to do, Jake," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't go back to Earl like this, but I don't know where to go. I don't even know what's next for me." Quote, Jake's heart went out to her. He had known the isolation of the land, the long, lonely stretches where it was just him and the wide open spaces. But he had never had to face what Maya was facing, the feeling of being trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, of being caught in a marriage that seemed to be slowly suffocating her. "You don't have to figure it out all at once," Jake said reassuringly, his tone gentle yet firm. "Take things one step at a time. You've already made it through the hardest part, just by making it here. You can stay as long as you need to." Maya met his gaze, her eyes softening. She looked at him as though she were seeing him for the first time, as though she were truly realizing that he wasn't just a neighbor or a stranger, but someone who was offering her something she hadn't expected. Kindness, and maybe even a chance for something better. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft wind howling outside. Finally, Maya spoke again, her voice much steadier than before. "I don't know what I would have done without you last night," she said quietly, her eyes downcast. "I don't know how to thank you." Jake shrugged, his usual modesty in place. "You don't need to thank me. I did what anyone would do." He gave her a small smile, but the warmth of his words lingered in the air. Just then, there was a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Maya stiffened, a look of fear flashing across her face. Jake stood up quickly, his protective instincts kicking in. He didn't have to guess who it was. "It's Earl," Maya said softly, her voice trembling. Jake walked toward the door, his hand on the handle. He paused for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know what Earl would say, or what he would do. But he couldn't let Maya go back to a life that was making her so unhappy, not without at least offering her a chance to choose something else. He opened the door to find Earl standing on the other side, his expression hard and unyielding. "Where is she?" Earl demanded, his voice rough. "I need to speak to my wife." Jake didn't back down, his voice calm but firm. Earl's gaze flickered with irritation, but he didn't push further. Maya stood behind Jake, her body tense but her eyes steady. She wasn't going back to a life that had only hurt her. She wasn't going back to Earl. Not until she had time to figure out who she really was, and what she wanted her future to be. "I'm not going back, Earl," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Not yet. I need time." Earl's face twisted in anger. But he didn't argue. He simply turned and walked away, his boots crunching in the snow as he left. Maya looked at Jake, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything." Jake nodded, knowing that the journey ahead for both of them would be difficult. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new for both of them.